Okay, so we're going to get started with exercise 210, which is, we're going back into VRay for a while. So today we'll spend time in VRay, and then we'll keep going. Just as a reminder, the assignment 201 is due on Wednesday. Apparently I made a mistake on the handout, and it says Monday 10-2. So I apologize if that confused anybody. But the good news is, if you were prepped and ready for today, you get a little extra time. So it's not the end of the world if it goes that way. If it went the other way and I made a mistake, I would honor it and extend it, but it's not a big deal. So it is due on Wednesday. If you already turned in, that's fine. If you want to edit it, that's okay too, going into Wednesday. It should be turned in before I start talking on Wednesday. Remember that you need those 3 views, not just 1 view. Somehow people sometimes forget to actually read what I'm asking for. If I ask for 3 views, submit 3 views, because the last thing you would want is to lose 33 or 66% because you just didn't turn in one of the views. So make sure that you do that. I don't know, for some reason on the final, people leave that kind of stuff off. They finish the final, but they leave 1 view off. And it's like, well, but you had it, so why didn't you give me the view? Anyway, so I'm just trying to emphasize that because there's no reason you shouldn't get the maximum amount of credit for it. So today we're going to talk about VRay Materials. And this is a little interesting because we're in VRay 3.6 now, and they treat materials slightly differently than the older versions of VRay. So I'm still going to go through the same basic principles. Most of the default materials that are built into VRay don't have one of the things that I'm going to talk about today. It doesn't mean that you can't apply it to it, but the defaults tend not to. So it's hard because the example that I'm going to use is based on an older set of materials to help you guys see it. So I have to kind of break this down. We'll get to the exercise in a second, but I have to kind of explain how materials are made up first. And I'll do that in a couple ways. One, I have a sample set of files here where I've rendered out different planes using different components of a material. And so we'll start with this one here. Let me switch over just so I can make this a little bit bigger. And I probably need something that I can draw with. So hold on a second. Good, I can draw. Okay, so as we think about a material, this is a shingle siding material. And I'll do some live renders with it. Yeah, you can see it. There are several components that make up the material itself. The first one here is called the diffuse map. So I'm going to put a D on it for right now. That's a terrible D. Let's try that again. My wrist twitched when I did it. The diffuse map, this first one, is essentially a colored picture of the material itself. The diffuse map isn't required for all materials, but generally when it's a photorealistic material like a shingle siding or something like that, generally you end up with a photo that's the backdrop. This photo here needs to be a tiling texture. You need to be able to copy and paste it over and over again such that the seams are seamless. So you can't tell where it starts and where it ends. If I were to open that one up, let me use that as an example here. Bear with me. This is that diffuse map for this material. So it's essentially it's a photograph of shingle siding. The people who made this set it up such that, what I'm doing here doesn't matter. I'm just showing you some illustrations. So bear with me for a second. Essentially, the idea here is that if I were to repeat this pattern over again, come on, there we go, and I put them such that they lined up together on an edge, they would end up forming a seamless piece. So I could take this and put it so that it lined up right there, and you get the idea. It ends up being consistent. Furthermore, it's seamless if I'm going up and down just as it would be from side to side. So I can keep this pattern going indefinitely because they continue to line up one to the next in all directions. That's what I mean by a tiling texture. We'll get to creating that a little bit later, but I wanted to explain what it was in the first place. So that first piece, there we go, that's the diffuse maps. That's the photograph. It's a tiling texture. The next piece down here is something that's called a bump map. So this one here is called a bump map. And that gives us small grain texture, things like the wood grain itself. So it's little stuff on the surface, because not all surfaces are perfectly smooth. They always have a little bit of texture to it. That's what the bump map does. The next one down here, and I'm going to go through all of these in a little bit more detail in just a second, is called the displacement. So I'm going to displacement, and that actually gives larger scale ups and downs. And so if you look at the edge here, it's got little jumps and these grooves in this. So it's big scale up and down. And then finally we get to where the material all comes together that gives us our full texture. So let's look at it in VRay for just a second. So I pulled up this little sample file so that I can do these renderings. And I'm going to turn off all of these and we'll preview them. So bear with me for a second in the asset edit here. Let me turn these guys off. I'm going to zoom in on this edge so we can kind of see what's happening. If I do this initial render with only the diffuse map, so only the basic map on, it's essentially taking the photograph and pasting it on each of the surfaces. And if we look at the edge here, it's going to be a straight edge there. It's going to meet at a straight edge there, and it'll be straight there as well. Does that kind of make sense? So it's just the photograph being placed on. If I add in the next one, so that was that first piece of the puzzle here. That was this one. If I add in the bump, great handwriting there. If I add in the bump map right here, let me turn that on. And we render it again. You can see that now the wood itself has a little bit of texture to it. You guys see how that it stands out just a little bit? Next thing, I'll add on the displacement map right here, and that's going to control the ups and downs of the shingles themselves. So this is where the edge is going to change. So as this starts to render, watch the edge. See how each of these shingles now sticks out? So the advantage here, and the reason that we build out our materials this way, is let's say we were doing a shingle siding building. It would be a lot of work to actually make all the little shingles such that we could render them. So instead, we can use just a flat surface on the wall and apply this kind of texture to it using VRay. So we just model the flat sheet, the flat surface, and we apply this to it, which causes it to look realistic and to ultimately render. So we need to be able to create the files or find the files that allow us to assemble this into one piece. Many of the VRay materials that are already loaded, or that are pre-done materials, they have some of these things built into them. Once you know where to look, you'll be able to find them. Today we're going to concentrate on assembling some materials and ultimately creating one of your own, I hope. I'm going to ask that you go and visit a website. It's called VRayMaterials.co.uk, I think. There we go. This company or this group has a lot of materials that you can download for free. Some materials you have to pay for. I'm not asking you to buy anything, so you don't need to buy anything. Some of these materials have bump maps, displacement maps. We'll get to transparency maps in a little bit that are built into them. Some of them don't. And so if we get in here into the VRay Materials, what I'm going to ask you to do to start is to, I'll try this one here, this granite one. And we're going to download it. And we're going to look at the files that come with it. So these people created this and have a couple different things for us. The first one here is the diffuse. So if I were to open the diffuse, we're going to see that it is essentially a seamless tiling texture of the granite itself. Okay, that's the most basic thing. So if you're not comfortable in Photoshop, finding a material that has this in it would be a good place to start. So that would be the granite itself. The only other thing that they have is a reflection. My guess is the reflection isn't going to be a lot of use to us. And part of the reason that they only have that is because this material itself is relatively shiny. Like, it's not meant to have a lot of texture to it, because it would be for a countertop. Let's see if we can find another material. Let's look at this one. Okay, so this one, which is that old cobblestone street, has a diffuse, it has a displacement, it has a reflection, and a reflection glossiness. The ones that we care about are the diffuse and the displacement for right now. So let's open both of those up and take a look at what they are. I'm going to open them in Photoshop because, go ahead and open it here. Oops, I have to extract it first. Hold on a second. Okay, so the diffuse and the displacement were the two that we were concerned with. So let's go ahead and open those up and take a look. So the diffuse is the color version. So this is that colored version. It's going to repeat. It's going to tile. At least it should tile. Again, I didn't create it, but I'm assuming that it will. The displacement, they didn't do the best job with this displacement. But the way a displacement works, and actually, you know what? For clarity purposes, let me go ahead and open back up the shingle siding one so I can talk you through each one of these files. I think it'll be clearer because this one has a more distinct setup. So let me go ahead and go to open. I'm going to jump over into that particular material so you can see it. Okay. These are the three files that matter for this. So the first one is the diffuse, which is this one. This was the one that I was showing you earlier. It's the tiling texture that looks like a photograph. The next one, or the bump map, is generally a high contrast black and white photograph of the texture. The key here is that the texture is going to come from the difference between the white and the black values. So they're going to say, take the plane, and anything, the lighter it is, the higher up it goes in the plane. So if we looked at it in cross-section, like if we were doing a cross-section here, we'd start at the lowest level black, and as we came up into anything lighter than that, it would stick up just a little bit in the texture. It's not a lot. It's just a little bit of fine-grained texture. So we create that using this simple black and white image. It needs to be high contrast, so you need to have a very strong white and a very strong black in the image. And then the grays that fall in between give us that little bit of texture. I can open up another one just so you could see it here. It helps to show do I not have one in that one? Yeah, none of those are particularly good. I'll find more. Let me just keep going because I don't want you guys to get too distracted. So In this scenario, the contrast between black and white gives us little pebbling on the surface, essentially. The displacement map is different. So what the displacement map does is it says, OK, at one end of the spectrum, in this case white, we're at 0 in our plane. As we go toward black, we're going to start to stick up a certain amount. So in this case, by going from a gradient from white here all the way up to black there, I'm creating a slope inside of the displacement. So it's going from 0, or flush with the surface, to sticking out by a certain amount. If I were to open, let me show you another one. The board and batten one is pretty good because it's a stark contrast right there. So my bump is here. It gives a little bit of the wood texture on it. My displacement is right here. So anything that's white is sticking out toward us. Anything that's black is sticking back. If you do this by mistake and you do inverse of black and white, it doesn't matter because there's a checkbox to invert it. So if you make a mistake and do one in black and one in white, and half the time I can't remember which one sticks out and which one doesn't. But the concept is still the same. So in this scenario, the white pieces would be sticking out toward us. The black pieces would be back flush with the surface. So that's causing us to create this texture. So those are the big differences. Same thing here. The difference here is that this slopes because it's a gradient from white to black. So if I go back to right here where you see all of those coming together, that's the combination of all of those components. So there's one more mapping type that we haven't discussed yet, and that is a transparency map. And so if I were to open up, I'm going to apply a different material to this and walk you through that one. So let me open my VRay asset editor again, and I'm actually going to import a material so that I can use one of the meshes that I created. There is a mesh pattern. It's a terrible noise. I'm going to do this mesh. The reason I'm going to do that is because I have the buildup of that mesh right here, so we can see it. So in this case, our first image right there is just a photograph of the mesh itself. Now, the places in between the yellow are obviously, we ultimately want them to be transparent, but we're not going to worry about those just yet. We have the image itself. Then below that we have our, in this case I skipped the bump map and moved to the displacement map because I wanted a little bit more texture there. It's wire mesh, so there's not too much fine grained texture. It's pretty smooth. I just needed to know that it was the kind of half circle arc of the mesh itself. The one below that is a transparency mesh. This controls what part of the image is transparent and what part of it is solid. And so when you combine all three of those together, you end up with the mesh without the background, with the little bit of texture to it, without the pieces that you don't want, and you end up with the mesh itself that will render. So let me show you that here in this view. There's that mesh file again. I'm going to turn off a few things first, and then we'll turn them back on. Oh, did I apply it? Hold on. All right. So when I go to render this one, oh, it's already transparent. That was a mistake. Supposed to be there. I love it when it doesn't do what I want it to do, right? Wrong slider. That was my mistake. Oops. Let's try that again. Nope, it still doesn't like me. Part of the problem is I'm trying to reverse engineer and get rid of there. I think I did it now. There we go. Sorry. So in this first option, this is without the transparency map applied. So I'm not controlling what's transparent about it. So we see just the image itself of the mesh with the backdrop here. I can then go in and add in the bump map or the displacement map. I think I have it set up as a bump map. Let me just double check here. Yep, perfect. I can add that in. If we were to render it now, instead of being perfectly flat, we'd have a little bit more texture on it. There you go. You can see how these start to feel like they're sticking up just a little bit. I should point out that when we're doing this kind of a texture, it's only one-sided. So I can create the arc on the top, but I can't create the second half because it's only sticking up. I can't make it completely round. The truth is, though, when you're rendering, it doesn't really matter because you render from far enough away. So now that I have that in, I have to make sure that I have that transparency map installed. And so let me go in here and add that in. And I'm going to show you how to do all of this in just a second. Go. Oh, so that was one that I did backwards. So I kept the pieces, the circles that I wanted to cut out instead of the mesh. So I need to make sure that I invert that. There's a checkbox for invert, but I forget where it is. So what happens when we switch versions? I apologize. Invert. There we go. There we go. Sorry, I knew it was there. When it's inverted here, now I'm going to get just the mesh like that. And when we go ahead and do our render, those pieces are going to become transparent. Another example that I have is here. It's a corrugated piece of steel. So I have the photograph for the diffuse map. The bump map here is a little bit of scratching that's on it. Again, it's just a high contrast black and white image. The third one down here is the displacement. This is where, through creating the gradient, I create the wave pattern on the steel. This would be a lot harder to actually make. You'd have to do some kind of a fancy loft or something to create this. Much easier to just create it on the surface here and then have VRay do it. We combine all of those together and we end up with the corrugated steel look. So that's how these materials work. That's how we assemble them. So let's talk about how do we actually create these materials from scratch or assemble these materials from what we have. So depending on what you download, and the first part of this, I've broken this kind of out into separate sections here. So first part, under part 1, I'm asking that you download this materialstest.3dm file, which is essentially the file that I have here. Sorry. This one right here, circle with the little box on top of it. This gives you, it's already got lighting set up, it's already ready to do the renders, so all you have to do is concentrate on applying the materials themselves. Now, part 2A, since there are people in this class that haven't graduated from my 135 class, this is what you'll be doing for the whole time. For those of you that have gone through 135, especially if you've gone through 135 with me, I have an expectation that you actually create a full material because you're capable of doing it, so I'll make you do it. If you took 135 with somebody else, you may or may not have the skill set to do it. I hope that you do. You should have the skill set to do it, so you can give it a shot if you want to. So that's why it's broken down into 2A and 2B. Ultimately, I'm asking you to create 4 materials today, and they can be a combination of the 2A and 2B strategies. So in the 2A strategy, for the non-135 graduates, this is where I'm asking you to go to that VRay Materials.box.uk or any other materials site where you can get materials, and we're going to find an example material. So in this case, the cobblestone was the one that I did, and we're going to create a VRay for Rhino material from that particular material. I should point out that, like the website Flying Architecture, this particular website is specific for VRay for Rhino. So if you download a material from their material archive here, there's your materials. If you download one of their materials, they have some that are charged, again, some that are free. They're going to work directly. They'll have the VR mat that you need to upload straight into Rhino, so you won't have to actually create the material. Some of the other websites, like this one, this vraymaterials.co.uk, they are meant for either 3D Studio Max or one of the other versions of the VRay plugin. The files are there. You just have to actually create the VRay material yourself. So we already have the diffuse file. We already have the displacement file if it's available, etc. So all you need is the zip file that they let you download, and then you can reassemble the material yourself in VRay and Rhino. So I'm going to go through kind of this process. I'll use the cobblestone one here as an example, and then I'll go through and I'll do it again. So I've already gone ahead and downloaded this file. You guys saw me do that. I did extract the file. That's important so that I have access to the various pieces. So there it is in its extracted folder with all of the pieces that come with it. Now in Rhino, I'm going to open the VRay Asset Editor, and I'm going to create a new material. So I'll click on this little new material icon down here at the bottom for Add Material. This is going to be a basic generic material. So I'll go ahead and click on that generic material. Let me close these side drawers so this gets less confusing here. And first thing I'll do is rename the material. So this is the old cobble material. The next thing is I need to load in the photograph that represents the material, so the diffuse map. So I'll open the drawer to the right here, and when I do that, you'll see that there are a variety of drawers that are available for me. The first one here under VRay BRDF will let me have access to diffuse. That's that colored image. So I'll expand diffuse, and under diffuse here, I need to choose, instead of the color, I need to actually choose a bitmap. So I'll click on the little checkerboard pattern. I should mention while we're here that all of this stuff is written out in the tutorials on the course website, and I have updated them. So if you go to tutorials and you go to VRay, and we go down here to diffuse map, I have it for version 3.6. This is what I'm going through, and then I saved the old version. So if you have the old version at home or something, you can still access it. So all of these things that I'm talking about are available so you can see them step by step. So don't panic and feel like you have to write it down, because it'll be there. OK, so back into Rhino and or VRay. I'm back into my VRay Asset Editor. I'm going to choose bitmap as my image, and I'm going to go to my downloads folder right here. And the first one that I want is the diffuse. Now, they don't always name them nicely. So again, this was created by somebody else. This person was very nice to us. They named it diffuse and displacement. Perfect. Sounds great. We're going to stick with just, if you create it, we'll name it like this. Otherwise, you might have to look around and kind of decide what's right. So I'm going to use the diffuse for this map. I'll go ahead and say OK. It'll show up there. The rest of these options are all fine by default. And I'll go ahead and click on back here. As soon as I do that, we're going to see the pattern on our preview show up. So that's good. If we were to apply this old cobble to the sample here, I can right-click, apply to layer, material test. And if I were to render it, oops. We would get a preview of what that cobble looks like. Sometimes you render from far away to kind of get a general idea, and then you want to zoom into one of the corners and double check things. That's fine. So sometimes it takes multiple renders to kind of test it out. OK, that looks pretty good. I'm getting it. It's a little bit light in its exposure, but that's OK. I'll still work with it. I'll stop that rendering for now, and I'll go back to my VRay asset editor. So I have a diffuse map in here. This one does not have a transparency associated with it, so I don't have to load a transparency map. It does, however, have a displacement map. So I would click on the maps down here at the bottom, and you see that there's three categories. We're going to work on bump and displacement. In this case, it's a displacement map, so I'm going to turn that one on. So I'll turn that little slider, and I will load up a bump map. So right now it's set for normal. I'm going to change it to, oh no, normal and displacement is correct, sorry. And I'm going to click this little checkerboard. And this is where I'm going to go to my bitmap, and they have a displacement bitmap for me. So I'll go ahead and load that one in, and I'll say open. And that then loads in. I'll go ahead and click back. And you can see that it's already giving me much more texture here. So when it comes to the amount of displacement, there are two ways of adjusting it. We have what's called normal displacement or 2D displacement. Either one. I'm going to stick with the normal displacement, and then the amount, I can type in a value here. This amount value is tied to the default units that you're working in. So if I were to type 1 here, the amount of displacement between white and black on my image is going to be 1 inch. If I put in 10, the amount of displacement would be 10 inches. And you can actually see when I adjust this. Let me put in 10. It's going to get all spiky looking because it's now pushing the difference between black and white really big. So in all reality, it's probably going to be for this about 1. So we'll leave it there. We'll go ahead and close this. And I'm going to zoom in a bit when we do the render. And we'll re-render and take a look. So we can already tell that it's still a little bit too spiky. So I probably need to adjust that a little bit further. Then we go back to my VRay asset editor here. I'll change my displacement amount to maybe 0.25. We'll stop the render, and we'll restart the render. And that feels pretty close to the texture. And I'm not going to sit here and wait for it to keep rendering out, but you guys can now see that particular texture and that particular pattern. So I'll go ahead and stop that. So once I've created the material, so in this case I've created this VRay material, we need to find a way to collect it. And as much as I whined and griped and said we really need VRay 3.6, we really need VRay 3.6, when the Chaos group, the people who write VRay, they stripped out one absolutely critical, easy command when they upgraded to 3.6. So we don't have the ability to pack a material like we used to, which is very frustrating to me. So we have to manually pack the material, and I'll walk you through how to do that. So the first thing we need to do is we need to save a file called a VRmat file. It's essentially the VRay Material file. So with my old cobble selected here, I'm going to click on the Save icon, this little disk. I'll click on Save, and I'm going to put it in a folder. I'll put it in today's folder. That's a good place for it. So let me go ahead and go into my live demonstrations for today. I'll create a new folder. We'll call this Old Cobble. And inside of that folder, we're going to save oldcobble.vrmat. That's the VRay Material file. This saves things like the amount of displacement that we put in, details of the material itself. So I'll go ahead and click on Save. And that then saves the VRmat file for later. Unfortunately, we also need any image files that we used with the material. So in this case, I need the diffuse and the displacement because we used both of those. So I need to go ahead and take those, copy them, so that they're not just in my downloads folder, and go to that old cobble, and I need to paste those inside of this folder because I need to keep each of those materials. The VRay 1.5 had the ability to right-click and say Pack Material, and it would create the VRmat and go find these two files and put them all in a zip file for you. It's really convenient, but they got rid of it. And I've looked on the forums, and they acknowledged that it was a mistake to get rid of it, but it's too much work to put it back into this version, so they're just going to put it in the next version of VRay. It is what it is. So we have to do it manually. So I put those two pieces in. So I have the VRmat, I have this image, and I have this image, the diffuse and the displacement. I need those to create this material. The next thing that I want to do is I want to do a full-size test render of this piece to make sure it turned out OK. So I'll go into my preset views. So let me click on this little triangle. I'll go to Set View, Render Material Test. It basically backs us off so that we see this in its full. And I'll go ahead and render it out. So I get a full-size sample of my render. So while this is rendering, I'm going to go back to the vraymaterials.co.uk site right here. See if I can find another material that's worth building. Corrugated cardboard, that's kind of interesting. Let's see what it comes with. All right, so once again, we have a diffuse and a displacement to work with. That's good. So I can make another material out of this corrugated cardboard with the diffuse and the displacement. I'll do that just for practice, and then we'll go into creating our own material from scratch. Let's see if it's finished its rendering. There you go, it's finished. So I'm going to go ahead and save the sample render file. I hope. There we go. And I need to save it into the same folder right there. And this is going to be the old cobble, and I'm going to add sample. So I know it's the sample of the render. And I'll go ahead and click on Save. So I've saved the sample. So inside of that folder, right here, I have the diffuse, I have the displacement, I have the sample file, and I have the VRmat. Those are the critical ingredients to this particular material. When I'm done with those, I'll take the old cobble file, I'll right-click on it, and I'll say Send to Compressed Zipped Folder. That will zip everything I need to make this material work in one place. There it is. This is the zip file that I'll upload to the course website today. That's one of the uploads, and I'll do that a little bit later on. I will use that zip file so that people could download and use this material, and I will use my sample right there as my featured image when I go to post it later on today. Okay. Like I said, I'm going to repeat myself here. We're going to create another material. We'll use that corrugated cardboard this time. Let me go into my VRay asset editor here. We're going to click on Add Material, or excuse me, yeah. add material. We're going to add a generic material. I'll double click on it and call this cardboard. First thing I need to do is load in my diffuse. So right here under diffuse, I'll click the checkerboard pattern. I'll click on bitmap. And I will go find the diffuse corrugated cardboard right there. And I'll go ahead and say open. I'll click on back. Now we see it applied. Next thing was the displacement map. So I'll open and expand maps. I'll turn on displacement. We'll open that one up here. And right here under the mode map, I'm going to click the checkerboard pattern. And again, click bitmap. And this time I'll choose their displacement image. I'll click on back. And we should see a little bit more displacement there. That's good. Remember, I might have to adjust this value. This is where the rendering is going to determine. So my guess is that this is going to be more like 0.25. Think about cardboard, how thick it is. It's going to be more like 0.25 because my units are in inches. That's good. We'll go ahead and do a test render. I may want to zoom in. My zoom is not working today. Like that. And we could do a test render here so we can see, does it look right? Oh, I forgot to apply the material. My mistake. Let me take the cardboard. I'll right click and say apply to layer, material test. And we'll start that render again. And it's looking pretty reasonable. At that point, I'll go ahead and jump back into I'll go to set view here, the full size, and I'll do the full size render. While that's doing it, I'll go ahead and go to my VRay asset editor, and I'm going to save the cardboard. I'll do that by clicking the little disk icon here. And we don't want it to go in the same folder. We'll create a new folder here. New folder. Come on there. And this was cardboard. And I'll go ahead and save it into the cardboard folder. There we go. This is still rendering, so I won't worry about that just yet. But I do have to go collect the diffuse and the displacement for the cardboard. So I'll right click and say copy. And then we'll jump over and we'll paste them in here. Those are my next two. And then the last piece will be the final render here. It's almost done, which I'll save into that folder as well. There we go. I'll click the save icon. And we'll call this cardboard sample. And I'll click save. Last thing is to make a zip file of that. So there's cardboard. I'll right click on it and say send to compressed zip folder. And it will then create the cardboard.zip file for me. So you're going to do that process with every one of your materials after you're finished creating it. Now, for those of you that have done 135 with me and are comfortable in Photoshop, I want to show you how to create a material completely from scratch without borrowing from anybody else. So if you're in that boat, I would encourage you to do at least one material today completely from scratch, because you'll learn a lot in the process thinking through this. Many of the materials that are available on the course website to download, at least the ones that I created, I went through and did this exact thing in Photoshop, where I thought about it and I built the material from scratch. So I'm going to start by looking for some images online that would be good examples of textures that I think would repeat nicely. I went to the website Unsplash because they have some pretty nice high quality images that are free to use. And I put in a search term for something like siding. And you get a bunch of examples of siding. Now when I look at examples of siding, a couple things I'm looking for. One, I'm looking for it to be pretty dead on. So I'm looking at perpendicular to the wall itself. So these are good examples of it. If I'm looking at an angle at it, say this, it's going to be much harder to work with and get it to tile. So that's not a particularly good example. I'm also looking for non-distinctive things that would repeat. So in this case, it's pretty straight on if I were to look at this image there. And I could use this part kind of in here. But see that shadow that goes across? You don't want that shadow to repeat over and over again. So we need things that aren't repeating. And so as we go through, we're looking for those kinds of images. The other thing that tends to happen is that you might end up, like this is a good example. That piece of wood would make a really nice tiling texture. But if you think about, we've got one light piece of wood here and a dark piece of wood there, it's going to get kind of messy, and we're going to have a distinct pattern. So that might not be the best option either. So take your time when you're trying to find the image in the first place. This one actually has very even lighting, and if I were to take a chunk out of here, that wouldn't be too bad. So you kind of have to play around with finding the images and finding one that you like. I've gone ahead and I've taken some that I thought would be reasonable and downloaded them into my flash drive already. Oh, here's another example. This one looks pretty good, except that you see the shadows up here are much larger and they get smaller as they go down. That's going to make blending the images together rather challenging. So you really have to pay a lot of attention to what they look like. Like this one here, that pattern is going to be problematic because you'd get that same pattern over and over again. So I already downloaded a few samples, and I'll work within that context. I'm going to open up Photoshop. I'll go to File and then Open, and I'll pick one of those samples. Let me go into today's folder. Okay, so these were the ones that I picked. I'm going to open them all up so you can see them. So those are the ones that I picked. I'm not going to do the shingle. I already have a pretty good shingle, but this would be an entertaining one to work with. There's one knot here that would be kind of problematic. That would appear over and over again. The rest of these are pretty decent and could make a nice material, but it's going to take me a lot longer than doing one of these other types of siding. This one's not too bad. We've got a little bit of peeling paint in there that would repeat. May or may not be advantageous. This one here is pretty clean. We've got some knots that would end up repeating, but it might work. And I have this one here. It's kind of like a decking. I think it might be a cast concrete deck, but that could be interesting as well. So any one of these would be okay. I'm going to show you how I would go about manipulating them. So we'll start with this one, this kind of turquoise siding. And the first thing to notice when I'm evaluating this is that there is some perspective to it. So these pieces up here slope slightly up. These pieces down here slope slightly down. The middle of the image is pretty decent. So I want to think about what part of the image I'm going to end up using, because I don't need to use the whole image. So I would say that I'd use somewhere between, maybe here and down to about here. That's about the chunk of the image that I want. So I don't really care about the parts that are up above. So I could start with the crop tool and just kind of shrink this down to the parts of the image that I think I'm going to end up using. And I'm not going to be, I'll have a little extra there, maybe about like that. So now let's take a look at these horizontal lines. I'm going to go into View, and I'm going to show my rulers. So I'm going to turn on my rulers, and that will allow me to drag down a guide to kind of see how far off it is. So this one's off by quite a bit. Coming down here, now that one's pretty darn close, both the shadow and the siding itself. So we'll come back and we'll revisit that one just a little bit, but this one definitely needs some tweaking to it. So to do that tweaking, I'm going to zoom out slightly. Control minus will do that. And I'll go up to Edit, and then, oops, I got to do a layer from background first. Let me right-click and say Layer from Background. And then I can go to Edit and Transform, and I'll use Skew. And when I use Skew, I'm able to adjust the sides of the image to get them such that they appear to be straight across. Sometimes you have to zoom in and zoom out and double check a few things. This might be a little bit further down there. Yeah, that's pretty good. Sometimes you need another guide to double check. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. Down there. So don't be afraid of extra guides, because it'll help you kind of align it. So this one didn't take too much skewing. I've done just a little bit of it. Next thing is to define actually where I want to make my crops. So we'll notice that there's a line of nail holes here, there's a line of nail holes here, there's a line of nail holes here, and there isn't one in here. So that's good. We want the spacing between these nail holes to be about the same. And so they're not too far off the way that they are. The top and the bottom, I want to make sure that I'm cutting this at a similar place. So if I were to cut it right there at the end of that joint, and to cut the bottom one right about there, that would be a pretty good place to cut them in terms of getting them to seam together. So like that. So I have them cut at about the right place. I have the sides at about the right place. Now it's time to do something called an offset filter. This really needs to go away. It's killing me. No, I don't. Let close. There we go. So under Filter, and then under Other, is something called Offset. And what the Offset filter does is it essentially cuts your image. So I would cut it right here. It would take this part of the image and stick it over there. So we know that the middle of the image, where it was cut, seams together perfectly. It takes those seamed pieces and flips them so that we can see the part that doesn't seam together perfectly. It will do it this way, but it will also do it this way. So it'll do it horizontally, it'll do it vertically, depending on which way you're looking at it, and we'll get a seam that goes down the middle here and a seam that goes across here. So I'll go up to Filter, I'll go to Other, and I'll go to Offset. And when I do that, I want these values to be about halfway. So as I start to creep this one over, do you guys see the seam that appears? So I want that to end up about halfway across the page, right about there. Now under Vertical here, as I start to create it, because of where I cropped, it's much harder to tell where the line is. Hold on. Yeah, I'm struggling to see it. Let me go back to 0. Let's see if I can find a knot that is obvious. OK, so right there is my knot. So there's my seam right in here. So it's awfully close anyway because of how I cropped it. So that's not going to take too much work for me to make that adjustment. So it's right here. So I'll go ahead and say OK. And I know that the sides are all going to tile together. Now it's just a matter of making this image look good. And I'll do that using the clone stamp tool. So right here is my clone stamp tool. I'll leave my brush relatively soft. I'll come in here, zoom in a little bit, and I need to blend these two together. I can end up making my brush a little bit bigger. You guys, if you took 135 with me, you already are familiar with the clone stamp tool. Essentially what you do is you copy from, I hold down Alt, I copy from something over to something else. Like that, and I can make that seam go away. These are a little bit harder because I need to blend those shadows together a little bit more. So let's go from this side. I'm going to go from right about here. Let's see if we can blend that shadow together just a little bit more. Take a little bit more from here. That's about right. Just soften that bend just a little bit. Same thing right about there. So you can see that I'm able to blend that together. I can hold down Alt and I could blend these together. I do let go of Alt, but it takes just a little bit of kind of looking at what's happening in the image here to sort out how to combine those together. So that's now combined together. I need to combine the white part across there. That's combined together. That one's okay. Come down here. This is just a matter of blending those colors just a bit. Now that's gone away. These two are going to be a little bit more challenging to get them to combine together. So I'll have to work our way across there a little bit. Notice I have a copy of this piece right there. I might not want that, so we can make that go away. We'll blend these together a little bit more. We'll come down here. I'll hold down Alt to about like that. This is where that seam was, and so I'm getting a little bit of a double shadow there, but it's not that noticeable. I don't want you guys to have to sit and watch me do this all day long, so I'm going to kind of rush through the rest of it and do some quick healing here. I told you this one with the peeling paint was always going to be the one that was a little bit more challenging. So blending those together will take a little bit more time. We may end up just losing a little bit of the peeling paint, something like that. Last piece here. Make that go across. Maybe it wasn't quite the last piece. I thought it was. All right, pretty good. Again, I rushed a little bit, but you can see that that seam has now gone away, which is the whole goal in the first place. So once those seams have gone away, I'll go ahead and save this. I'll go to File and then Save As. Or excuse me, let me go to Export As. File, Export, Export As. Under my formatting settings here, a JPEG is just fine. The sizes are all just fine. I'm going to go ahead and click on Export All. And I'm going to save this in a new folder. Let me go to New Folder. We'll call this Blue Siding. And this would be Blue Siding Diffuse, because that's going to be my diffuse map. I'll come back and do the bump map in just a second, but let's jump over into Rhino and VRay here. I'll create a new material. This is generic, and we'll call this blue siding. There we go. Under diffuse, I'll open up that map. So I'll click the checkerboard pattern. I'll click on bitmap here, and I'll go and find my blue siding. Thought I saved it there. I put it there instead of putting it in the folder. That's my fault. And there it is, blue siding diffuse. I'll say open. There it is there. I'll click on back, and we can see it applied. I can right click and say apply to layer, material test, and we could actually do a test render of it right now to see it with its siding on. It's pretty good. Next piece is to create the bump, to create the fine texture that's part of this particular piece of siding. So I'll come back here. And as I said before, the bump map is just a high contrast black and white image of our colored version. So what I'll do is I'll go up, and you guys have done this in 135 with me. We're going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we'll do a channel mixer first. This is going to be the black and white. I'll say OK. We'll check the box for monochrome. That turns it to black and white. You may want to go through the presets and decide if there's one of the presets that's better or worse than the rest. Like I said, we want high contrast. So that one's actually not too bad in terms of high contrast. It's not necessarily the most beautiful image. It's the one that shows the most contrast. Sometimes the infrared does a good job as well. That's not quite enough. So I'm going to jump to the red filter. And now it's in black and white. Next thing I'll do is I'll open up the levels adjustment. So I'll go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels. We'll say OK. And under this, I'm going to pull the white slider down so that I have a strong white and I have a strong black. So I have a strong black in those shadows, probably about like that. I have a strong white there. You can even adjust middle so that you get a good control of your texture. And it's right about like that. So again, this is about the fine detail. This is about the little knots and the nail holes and that sort of thing. So once this is set up, I'll go to the same thing here. File, Export, Export As, JPEG. Go ahead and say OK. And this one, instead of diffuse, is going to be the bump. So I'll add underscore bump and click on Save. Now if I were to go back into Rhino here, in my VRay Asset Editor, I'd come down to Maps, I'd go to Bump, I'd turn that on, I'd click on my bump map, again go to Bitmap, and this time I'd find the bump right there. I'll click back. We suddenly have some texture. We could zoom in. A little bit on it, and we could do a render to see it. And yeah, we're seeing the grain start to show up for the wood. So that's the bump part of it. So that's giving me the grain on the wood. The next thing is the displacement. So what makes this siding work? So let's go ahead and go back to Photoshop and look at the siding. So this is a basic lap siding. So if I were to look at it, I can turn off the bump. So we're looking at the color version. I have a flat part here. Then it goes back and tucks under the next piece. And each edge has a little bit of a rounded edge to it. So I need to create a black and white file where this piece here on every one of the boards is one color. The piece back here is another color, and there's a little bit of a gradient in between. So I'll go about creating it. We'll zoom out. I'm going to create a brand new layer right here. And I'm going to start with the black and white pieces. So I know that this piece, for example, straight across, and this next piece, I could go through and do this for each one. That was bad. Try that selection. I'm going to hold down Shift as I do this to be able to create multiple selections. Perfect. So I created all those sections. I will then use my paintbrush. We'll do it in white. I'm not sure which one is the one that sticks out and which one doesn't. Did I say that on here? White or flush with the surface. So this should be black. And I'll paint these in black. I'm going to make my brush bigger to make this a little faster here. And so I have all of those painted in black. Now, don't be confused by the shadow. So there's a little bit of a shadow there, but that has nothing to do with the depth of the siding. That's just a shadow. So we're going to take and make a selection from here to there, which is the part that tucks under for each of these. So I'll go there. Let me zoom out a little bit, make this a little easier. All right, and I'm going to paint all of those in white. So I'll double click, change my color to white, switch over to the brush, and I'll paint all of those in white, like that. Now I need to do the gradient transitions, because these have slope to them. So I'll take and do these one at a time. So I'll take this one here, and I need to go from white to black. I'll use the gradient tool right here. I'm going to make sure that I have white and black as my two colors. There we go. So I'm transitioning from white to black, and I'll go from one piece. I like to hold down Shift so I know it's in line, to the other piece, and I should get a transition from white to black. I can do that for each one of these. So it takes a little bit of time to do it. We'll select this. We'll go back to the gradient. Again, I'll hold down Shift, and we'll make that transition. You can see why I'm not requiring as many of these, because it takes a lot more work to build a material completely from scratch. The advantage of learning how to do it, though, is that going forward, if you ever have a material and you can't find the one that you want, you know that you're able to make it. Oops, that was a bad selection. Okay, so I've made those on the bottom. I need to do the same thing on the top for the part where it curves over. So I'll make it, but it's going the opposite direction. So this time the gradient would go from here down, and I'd end up like that. Oops, sorry, never mind, it's this way. Going up like that. At that point, I could save myself a little bit of work. I'm just going to copy this and reuse it on these other ones, because you guys don't want to sit here and watch me go through it. Let me go ahead and copy the lower one. No. All right, well, I have to do a few more. I apologize, because there's no real way around actually doing it in front of you. So it always takes a little bit of time. Looks like my copy and paste, I made a slight mistake there. I'll come back and correct that in a little bit. But in the interest of moving on, there's my displacement map. I'll go ahead and go to File, and then Export, and Export As. I'll go ahead and click on export. And this is going to be the displacement. And I'll go ahead and click save. And now when we jump back into Rhino here, there was our one with the texture on it. You can really see the texture of the wood now. We need to add in that displacement map. So we'll open the VRay asset editor. We'll go to my materials. We'll go to the blue siding. We're going to turn on the displacement now. There it is. We'll click on the little checkerboard, click on bitmap, and we'll load up the displacement. We'll click back. We need to think about the distance. It's probably about 0.5 or so, half an inch thick. We'll see it looks a little funky here. We'll go ahead and render it on its in place here and take a look and see if we like it or whether it needs to be adjusted. No, looks like I created it backwards. I told you I make mistakes with that. So I'll go back into my asset editor here, and I just need to be able to flip the bitmap here. Let me invert it. There it is. My distance might be a little high too, and we'll go ahead and we'll re-render it again. And there we go. So you can see on this edge, it's rounding over. There it's rounding over and tucking under the siding. And so we've now created the siding displacement. Does that kind of make sense? It's a lot of work to go through and make these textures, but that's also how you create realistic textures. Now in this particular example, if I didn't like the blue, I could live with just the bump and the displacement and then get rid of the color texture, and it would be just black and white. I could also apply a color diffuse. So I could put the color of the paint that I wanted on and paint the building that color instead of relying on the blue. So sometimes you can end up extending it that much further. OK, so now that I've created this, I have to go through the same steps that I did last time. I need to go into my VRay asset editor here. I need to click on the material itself and then save it. I'll click on the disk icon. And I would go into my blue siding folder, and I would save blue siding. Why is it saying cardboard? Let's make sure I'm saving this. There we go. Save. Hello. There we go. And we'll click Save. In that folder, I already have my bump, diffuse, and displacement. So I already have those pieces. The only thing I need at this point is the render from further away. So I'll click the triangle here, go to Set View, Render Material Test. There it is. And I'll go ahead and render out this view of it as well. OK, so that's the full rundown. I know I talked for a long time today, but I wanted to walk you through how you can create something completely from scratch. And so that's part 2B. I would encourage you to try to do that. When you're done today, you're going to be uploading. You'll create separate posts for each one of your materials. So I'll go ahead and go back here. I'm going to click on New, and then New Post. And I'll do a post for my blue siding. So I'll do blue siding. I'm going to go ahead and click on Add Media. And then under Upload Files, I'm going to upload this zip file, which of course isn't quite ready yet. Oh, it didn't even re-render. I'll have to let that re-render in a second. But the zip file itself, I would right-click on it, say Send to Compressed Zipped Folder. There it is. So I'll upload that zip file. I'll jump over here. I'll click Select Files. And there's the zip file. I'll click open. Once it's uploaded, I'm going to click on insert into post. That will give me a link. I could do some formatting here if I wanted to. I could put that as a bullet point and something like that. As I come down here on the right, there's a category for VRay Materials. If you want somebody to be able to find it, you could go through and add some of the little tags for it. So wood, this might be a wood. Anyway, then I'll scroll all the way down, and when I set the featured image, it's going to be the rendered file. So this one right here is going to be the file. Let me save it. This is blue. Sample. Click save. That will be my featured image, so we'll need to upload that. And I'll click on set featured image, and then I can scroll back up and I can go ahead and publish. So the image file is the featured image, and the zip file is what somebody would need if they wanted to be able to use that material going forward. Okay? So I'm going to turn you guys loose. There's a lot to do. I'm sorry that it took me so long to explain all of it, but at the same time, it's an important kind of lesson about how do you create materials completely from scratch. So I'm looking for 4 materials today. They don't all have to be from scratch. If you've taken 135, I have an expectation that at least one of them would be from scratch. All right. If you're in 135 right now, you still have done enough work in Photoshop to be able to do it. So you can still do it as well. All right. That's it. I'll let you guys start working.